Ambassador Lisa Carter found herself sitting on a hard metal bench in what could only be described as a holding cell. The walls were plain gray, and the only light came from strips in the ceiling that hummed with electrical noise. She had been separated from Jake and the others 3 hours ago, and still had no idea where they were or what was happening to them. The cell contained 12 other aliens, and Lisa studied each one carefully. They all wore the same gray uniforms and had the same defeated look in their eyes. Most sat quietly, but a few paced back and forth like caged animals. Lisa noticed that despite their different appearances, they all shared certain traits. Sharp teeth, claws, thick skin, or other features that suggested they came from dangerous worlds. A reptilian creature with dark green scales and bright yellow eyes sat down next to Lisa on the bench. When it spoke, its voice was rough and deep like gravel in a cement mixer. You are the human, yes. I am Zixtar from the lava world Kethmar. I have been here for 6 months. Lisa turned to face the alien and tried to hide her shock. 6 months. But surely there are legal procedures for diplomatic contacts. Zixtar made a sound that might have been laughter. Legal procedures are for civilized species. We are Deathworld specimens. We have no rights under council law. That's impossible, Lisa said. Every intelligent species has basic rights under any civilized legal system. You still think like a free being, Zixtar replied. Sadly, the council does not see us as people. We are resources to be managed and used. My people were contacted by the council 50 years ago. We thought it was first contact. Instead, it was conquest. Lisa felt her heart sinking as she listened to the alien story. What happened to your world? The council decided that Kethmar was too dangerous to remain independent. They said my people were too violent and primitive to govern themselves. Now my world is a mining colony worked by Kethmar. Slaves under council supervision, a creature that looked like a walking tree with silver bark joined their conversation. Its voice sounded like wind through leaves. The same happened to my forest world Sylvana. The council said we were too aggressive because we had to fight the metal-eating insects that lived in our soil. Now we grow food for their garden world. Populations. Lisa looked around the cell and realized that every alien there had a similar story. The council had made first contact with their worlds and then found excuses to classify them as dangerous. Once a species was labeled as Deathworld barbarians, they lost all rights and became property of the galactic government. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison stood in a different room facing what the aliens called an aptitude evaluation. The room was large and filled with obstacles that looked like a military training course mixed with a playground designed by someone who had never seen either. High Arbiter Quellenth floated above the course in a crystalline body that sparkled with internal light. The alien's voice came from speakers mounted in the walls and sounded like breaking glass. Human specimen, you will complete the evaluation course. Your performance will determine your assignment within council service. Jake looked at the course and saw that it was designed to be humiliating rather than challenging. The obstacles were too low for his height and painted in bright childish colors. Signs written in multiple languages explained that this was a test of basic motor skills and intelligence for primitive species. I'm not a specimen, Jake said firmly. I'm the captain of a diplomatic mission from Earth. You are what the council determines you to be, Quellenth replied. Begin the evaluation or face immediate termination. Jake gritted his teeth and started the course. He crawled through tunnels meant for creatures half his size and jumped over barriers that barely reached his knees. The whole thing felt like a cruel joke designed to make him look foolish. Other aliens watched from observation windows above, and Jake could hear some of them making sounds that might have been laughter. The worst part was that the course was being recorded. Jake knew that this humiliating footage would probably be shown to other species as an example of how primitive humans were. But he also knew that refusing to participate would likely mean death for his entire team. In another part of the station, Dr. Kevin Walsh sat in a sterile laboratory surrounded by scanning equipment. Alien technicians moved around him taking readings and collecting samples. They treated him like an interesting specimen rather than a person and spoke about him in the third person even when he was right there. The human shows typical Deathworld adaptations, one technician said to another. Dense bone structure, redundant organ systems, and elevated stress hormone production. Clearly evolved for survival in extreme conditions, Kevin tried to engage them in scientific discussion. Actually, human biology is quite fascinating. We have remarkable healing abilities and can adapt to a wide range of environments. Our brains are particularly complex. The technicians ignored him completely. To them, he was just another primitive creature to be cataloged and processed. Kevin realized that his decades of scientific training meant nothing to these aliens. They had already decided that Deathworld species were incapable of true intelligence or civilization. Engineer Rick Peters found himself in a maintenance bay being ordered around by alien supervisors. They had given him basic tools and simple repair tasks that any first-year engineering student could handle. The work was mind-numbingly boring and clearly designed to waste his skills. "Human, repair this power coupling," ordered a supervisor that looked like a floating jellyfish. "Use only the tools provided." No improvisation allowed. Rick looked at the coupling and immediately saw that it was designed poorly. The alien technology was functional but inefficient and used outdated engineering principles. He could improve the design in minutes, but the supervisors had made it clear that any deviation from instructions would be punished. As he worked, Rick began to understand the deeper problem with Council Society. They had eliminated all the species that were good at innovation and problem-solving. The remaining civilized species were content to use the same technology and methods for thousands of years without improvement. They had created a stagnant society that feared change and creativity. Security Chief Amy Johnson stood in a different kind of room entirely. It was clearly an arena with high walls and sandy floor. Weapons of various types hung on racks around the walls, and viewing galleries surrounded the space. Amy had been told that she would participate in combat demonstrations for the entertainment of higher caste species. "The human will face 3 opponents," announced a voice from the speakers. "Victory is not expected, but effort will be noted in your permanent record." Amy looked at her opponents and felt a mix of anger and pity. They were all from worlds that the Council considered dangerous, but none of them looked like they had ever been in a real fight. Their movements were clumsy and their weapons handling was amateur at best. These weren't warriors. They were just other slaves being forced to fight for the amusement of their masters. The first opponent rushed at Amy with a crude sword raised high above his head. Amy easily sidestepped the clumsy attack and used his own momentum to send him crashing into the wall. The second opponent tried to be more careful, but telegraphed every move so clearly that Amy had no trouble disarming him. The third opponent simply dropped his weapon and refused to fight. The audience in the viewing galleries fell silent. They had expected a brief and brutal demonstration of civilized superiority over primitive barbarians. Instead, they had witnessed a display of skill and restraint that challenged their fundamental beliefs about Deathworld species. Amy looked up at the viewing galleries and saw hundreds of aliens staring down at her with confusion and fear. For the first time in their lives, they were seeing what a real warrior looked like. Someone who had been forged by genuine hardship and trained by necessity rather than privilege. High Arbiter Quellenth's voice crackled through the speakers with barely controlled anger. "The demonstration is concluded. All specimens returned to holding areas immediately." As Amy was escorted back to her cell, she caught glimpses of Jake, Kevin, and Rick being moved through the corridors. They all looked frustrated and angry but unharmed. Amy hoped that Lisa was safe wherever they were keeping her. The 5 humans were learning the harsh reality of galactic politics. In this civilization, power came from weakness rather than strength. The most helpless species ruled over those who had proven their ability to survive and adapt. It was a system that could only exist by constantly suppressing anyone who might challenge it, but systems built on oppression always contained the seeds of their own destruction. The Council had spent centuries eliminating species that might resist their rule. Now they faced humans who had evolved on the most dangerous world they had ever encountered. The galaxy was about to learn what happened when Deathworlders decided that the rules needed to change. Ambassador Lisa Carter had spent 3 sleepless days in the holding cell, learning the terrible truth about galactic civilization. The stories told by her fellow prisoners painted a picture of systematic oppression that made her stomach turn. Every species in the cell had been contacted by the Council under the pretense of peaceful first contact, only to be enslaved and exploited. When the guards finally came for her, Lisa felt a mix of relief and dread. She was escorted through gleaming corridors filled with beautiful artwork and flowing water features. The contrast between the luxury of the upper levels and the prison conditions below was stark and deliberate. The Council wanted their prisoners to see what they could never have. The escort led Lisa to a massive chamber with a dome ceiling that showed a perfect view of the stars. At the center of the room sat a creature that looked like a giant slug, covered in pale pink skin. Its body was soft and rounded with no visible bones or muscles. 4 delicate tentacles emerged from its head, and its eyes were large and completely black. "Human creature, I am Counselor Velanathi of the Third Circle," the alien said in a voice like singing wind chimes. "You may approach, but do not come closer." Then the marked line. Lisa looked down and saw a red line painted on the floor about 10 feet away from the counselor. She walked to the line and stopped, then gave a slight bow that she hoped would show respect without appearing submissive. "Counselor Velanathi, I am Ambassador Lisa Carter representing the United Earth Government. I request immediate diplomatic recognition and the release of my team members." The counselor's tentacles waved in what might have been amusement. "You speak of rights and recognition as if you were a civilized being. Your species evolved on a Class 12 death world. You are barely above the level of wild animals." Lisa felt her diplomatic training taking over as she forced herself to remain calm. "With respect, Counselor, our technological achievements and peaceful intentions should speak for themselves. We've traveled across interstellar space to meet with you in good faith." "Technology can be stolen or copied," Velanathi replied dismissively. "Your true nature is written in your biology. You come from a world of constant violence and death. You cannot understand concepts like peace or cooperation because survival is all you know." "That's not true," Lisa said firmly. "Humans have built great civilizations based on cooperation and mutual aid. We've overcome our violent past through reason and education." The counselor's eyes blinked slowly and its tentacles curled in what was clearly disgust. "You cannot overcome your nature any more than a predator can choose to eat plants. The Council has studied hundreds of Deathworld species and they all follow the same pattern. Violence, aggression, and the inability to accept proper authority." Lisa realized that she was facing something worse than simple prejudice. The Council had built their entire worldview around the idea that peaceful species were inherently superior to those that had faced hardship. They literally could not conceive of the possibility that they might be wrong. Meanwhile, Captain Jake Morrison sat in a different kind of meeting room facing High Arbiter Quellenth. The crystalline alien floated behind a barrier of energy that crackled with electrical discharges. Jake had been brought here after completing a series of increasingly humiliating tests designed to break his spirit. "Human specimen, your performance has been noted," Quellenth said in its voice like breaking glass. "You show typical Deathworld traits of stubbornness and aggression. However, your technical knowledge may have limited value." Jake leaned forward in his chair and looked directly at the alien. "I'm offering you a chance at peaceful cooperation between our species. My people have much to contribute to galactic civilization. Your people have nothing we need," Quellenth replied coldly. "Deathworld species exist to serve civilized beings. That is the natural order of the galaxy." "Natural order," Jake repeated with growing anger. "You mean the order you've imposed through force and intimidation." The High Arbiter's crystalline body flared with bright light. "We have brought peace and stability to 800 worlds. Before Council rule, the galaxy was chaos with constant warfare between primitive species." Jake stood up despite the energy barrier crackling between them. "You've brought slavery and genocide. How many species have you wiped out for refusing to submit?" species that cannot adapt to civilized society, remove themselves from the gene pool, Quellant said without emotion. This is evolution in action. Only the most peaceful and cooperative beings deserve to inherit the galaxy. Dr. Kevin Walsh had been moved to a research facility where council scientists were studying human biology. The alien researchers treated him like a laboratory specimen while discussing their findings in voices that showed no recognition of his intelligence or personhood. The human cranial capacity is surprisingly large, one researcher noted while taking measurements of Kevin's skull. However, the brain structure shows clear signs of primitive development. Kevin tried to engage them in scientific discussion. Actually, human neural architecture is quite sophisticated. We have highly developed regions for abstract thinking, problem-solving, and creative reasoning. The researchers ignored him completely. To them, he was just another specimen to be cataloged and filed away. Kevin realized that these aliens had never encountered a species that could match their intellectual capabilities. They had eliminated all potential rivals long ago. The muscle density is typical of Deathworld species, another researcher commented. Clearly adapted for violent confrontation rather than peaceful interaction. Kevin watched as they recorded data that would be used to justify humanity's classification as a dangerous species. Every human adaptation that had allowed them to survive on Earth was being twisted into evidence of their primitive nature. Engineer Rick Peters had been assigned to a maintenance crew working in the station's lower levels. The alien supervisors gave him simple tasks that insulted his intelligence while treating him like a dangerous animal that might attack at any moment. "Human, repair this power conduit," ordered a supervisor that looked like a floating jellyfish. "Do not deviate from approved procedures. Do not touch any other equipment." Rick looked at the power conduit and immediately saw 3 ways to improve its efficiency. The alien technology was functional but crude, using design principles that human engineers had abandoned decades ago. But any attempt to suggest improvements was met with punishment. As he worked, Rick began to understand the deeper problem with Council Society. They had eliminated all the species that were good at innovation and problem-solving. The remaining civilized species were content to use the same technology and methods for thousands of years without improvement. Security Chief Amy Johnson had been moved to a gladiatorial training facility where she was forced to fight for the entertainment of higher caste species. The other fighters were all from Deathworld species, but none of them had any real combat training. They were just slaves being forced to hurt each other for alien amusement. "The human will face 5 opponents today," announced the arena master. "Victory is not expected, but courage will be noted." Amy looked at her opponents and felt sick. They were all scared and desperate beings who had been forced into this situation. These weren't warriors. They were victims of the same system that had trapped her. The first opponent rushed at Amy with a crude spear, but his movements were clumsy and desperate. Amy easily disarmed him and used minimal force to pin him to the ground. The second and third opponents tried to coordinate their attacks, but they had no training or experience working together. Amy found herself in the impossible situation of having to hurt other victims to survive while providing entertainment for the aliens who had enslaved them all. She began to understand that this was the true purpose of the gladiatorial games. Not just to entertain the ruling class, but to turn the oppressed against each other. As the days passed, the 5 humans began to see the full scope of what they were facing. The Council hadn't just conquered the galaxy. They had reshaped it according to their own twisted vision of what civilization should be. They had eliminated diversity, creativity, and the ability to adapt or change, but they had also created the conditions for their own downfall. By suppressing all the strong and innovative species, they had made themselves weak and dependent. They had built a house of cards that looked impressive from the outside, but would collapse at the first real challenge. The breaking point came when Lisa was brought to witness an execution. A group of young aliens from various Deathworld species had been caught trying to organize a resistance movement. They were going to be killed as an example to others who might think about rebellion. Let this be a lesson to all Deathworld specimens. Counselor Velanathi announced to the assembled crowd. The Council's authority is absolute. Resistance will be met with immediate termination. Lisa watched in horror as the young aliens were led to an execution platform. They were barely adults and their only crime had been dreaming of freedom. As the executioner raised his weapon, Lisa made a decision that would change everything. She broke past the guards and ran toward the execution platform, shouting at the top of her lungs, "Stop this madness! These are children. They've done nothing wrong." The guards tried to stop her, but Lisa had spent years training in self-defense. The alarm screaming through the station marked the beginning of something the Galactic Council had never experienced in over 1,000 years of rule. Ambassador Lisa Carter stood on the execution platform, breathing hard and surrounded by confused guards who had no idea how to handle a situation that wasn't covered in their protocols. Counselor Velanathi's tentacles writhed with rage as its voice boomed through the chamber speakers. "Seize the Deathworld creature immediately. Execute it along with the other primitives." But something unexpected happened in that moment. The young aliens that Lisa had tried to save looked at her with amazement rather than fear. For the first time in their lives, they had seen someone stand up to the Council's authority and survive longer than a few seconds. More importantly, the hundreds of Deathworld species watching from the gallery began to murmur and shift. Restlessly, Lisa raised her hands to show she wasn't carrying weapons, but her voice carried clearly across the chamber. "I am a diplomatic representative of the human species. If you kill me, you'll be committing an act of war against Earth, High Arbiter." Quellenth materialized next to the platform in a flash of crystalline light. "Your species has no standing to declare war. You are specimens in our collection. Then why are you so afraid of one unarmed woman?" Lisa shot back. "If we're really just primitive animals, why do you need an army to control us?" The question hung in the air like a challenge that echoed through every corner of the station. For centuries, the Council had maintained power by convincing everyone that Deathworld species were naturally inferior. But Lisa's simple act of defiance had exposed the lie that held their entire system together. "Captain," Jake Morrison heard the alarms from his holding cell and immediately understood that something had gone wrong. The guards who normally watched the Deathworld prisoners with bored contempt now looked nervous and kept checking their weapons. Jake caught the eye of Zixtar, the reptilian alien who had become his closest ally among the prisoners. "Something big is happening," Zixtar whispered. "The guards are scared." Jake nodded and began to quietly move through the cell, talking to other prisoners. Most of them had given up hope long ago, but Jake could see a spark of something new in their eyes. Word was spreading through whispered conversations that one of the humans had actually fought back against the Council. "Listen to me," Jake said in a low voice that somehow carried to every corner of the cell. "We've all been told that resistance is impossible, that the Council is too powerful and we're too weak. But they're afraid of us. That's why they keep us locked up instead of just letting us work freely." A creature that looked like a walking crystal tree shook its head sadly. "Even if we escape this cell, where would we go? They control the entire galaxy. They control the galaxy because nobody has ever really fought back," Jake replied. "Every species they conquered gave up after the first defeat. But humans don't give up. We've been fighting impossible odds for our entire evolutionary history." In the engineering section, Rick Peters was pretending to work on a power coupling while actually studying the station's internal systems. The alien supervisors had grown complacent after months of ordering Deathworld slaves around, and they weren't paying close attention to what he was doing. Rick had discovered something that would have shocked the Council if they had bothered to listen to Deathworld input. The station's technology was incredibly advanced, but also incredibly inefficient. The aliens had built massive redundant systems to prevent any possibility of failure, but they had never bothered to optimize anything for maximum performance. More importantly, Rick had found evidence that the station's security systems were designed to keep prisoners in rather than to repel external attacks. The Council had never faced a real military threat, so their defenses were focused entirely on internal control. When the alarm started blaring, Rick made his move. He had spent weeks memorizing the station's power grid, and he knew exactly which circuits to overload to cause maximum chaos. His alien supervisors were too busy panicking about the emergency to notice that their human slave was systematically sabotaging critical systems. Dr. Kevin Walsh was in the research lab when the alarms began, and he watched with fascination as the alien scientists completely fell apart under stress. These beings had lived their entire lives in perfect safety, and they had no idea how to handle an actual crisis situation. "What do we do?" one researcher asked frantically as emergency lights flashed throughout the lab. "Follow Emergency Protocol 7, another replied while checking a thick manual. "All specimens must be secured in their containment units," Kevin realized. That this was his chance to do something that would have been impossible under normal circumstances. While the aliens were distracted, he accessed their computer systems and began downloading everything he could find about the Council's classification system and their records of conquered species. What he found in those files made his blood run cold. The Council hadn't just conquered Deathworld species. They had systematically exterminated any civilization that showed signs of technological innovation or independent thinking. Over the past millennium, they had destroyed hundreds of species whose only crime was being too creative or too stubborn to accept subjugation. Security Chief Amy Johnson was in the gladiatorial arena when the alarms started, and she immediately knew that this was the moment she had been waiting for. The arena guards were trained to handle individual fighters, but they had no experience dealing with coordinated resistance. Amy looked around at the other fighters and saw the same realization dawning in their eyes. For the first time since arriving at the station, they outnumbered their captors and they had nothing left to lose. "Everyone listen to me," Amy shouted over the noise of the alarms. "We can take these guards if we work together, but we have to move now before reinforcements arrive." The alien fighters looked at each other with uncertainty and fear. They had been beaten down for so long that the idea of fighting back seemed impossible. But then one of them stepped forward and picked up a weapon from the arena floor. "I am Kothruk of the ice world Veltar," the alien said in a voice like grinding stone. "My people were warriors before the Council broke us. If there is a chance to strike back, then I will take it one." By one, the other fighters began to arm themselves and move toward the arena exits. Amy felt a surge of pride as she watched these broken beings transform back into the warriors their species had once been. The uprising spread through the station's lower levels like wildfire as word passed from cell to cell that the humans had started something that couldn't be stopped. Deathworld species that had accepted their fate for decades suddenly remembered what it felt like to have hope. High Arbiter Quellenth appeared in the station's command center surrounded by panicking Council officials who had never dealt with anything more serious than scheduling disputes between member worlds. "How many prisoners have escaped?" Quellenth demanded. "Unknown," replied a nervous communications officer. "The security systems are malfunctioning and we're getting conflicting reports from all sectors." "Then deploy the enforcement fleets," Quellenth ordered. "Destroy any ship that tries to leave the station and prepare to terminate all Deathworld specimens." But the Council had made a critical error in their response. They were treating the uprising like a simple prison break instead of recognizing it for what it really was. This wasn't just an escape attempt. It was the beginning of a revolution that would spread to every corner of the galaxy. Captain Jake Morrison had broken out of his cell along with 30 other Deathworld prisoners, and they were fighting their way through the station's corridors using improvised weapons and tactics that the guards had never encountered. The Council's security forces were trained to handle individual troublemakers, but they had no experience with organized military resistance. "The humans are leading coordinated attacks on multiple levels," reported a security commander. "Their tactics are unlike anything in our databases." Ambassador Lisa Carter had joined up with Jake's group after escaping from the execution chamber, and together they were transforming the chaotic prison break into something much more dangerous. Lisa's diplomatic training combined with Jake's military experience was turning desperate aliens into an effective fighting force. "We need to reach the communications center," Lisa told Jake as they fought their way through another squad of guards. If we can broadcast what's really happening here, then other Deathworld species throughout the galaxy will know they're not alone. Engineer Rick Peters had sabotaged enough systems to throw the entire station into chaos, but his real target was the main computer core. If he could access the Council's central database, he could download proof of their crimes and broadcast it to every world in the galaxy. Dr. Kevin Walsh had already gathered evidence of the Council's systematic genocide, but he needed to find a way to transmit that information beyond the station. The alien communication systems were sophisticated, but they were also heavily monitored and controlled. Security Chief Amy Johnson led her army of gladiator slaves through the station's middle levels, heading for the armory where real weapons were stored. Her group was growing larger as they freed more prisoners and picked up alien slaves who had decided that dying on their feet was better than living on their knees. Captain Jake Morrison stood in the station's main communications center, surrounded by freed prisoners from dozens of different worlds. The room hummed with energy as Dr. Kevin Walsh worked frantically at the central computer terminal while Ambassador Lisa Carter prepared to broadcast a message that would change the galaxy forever. "I'm in the system," Kevin announced as data streams flowed across multiple screens. The Council's database contains records of over 300 species that they've eliminated completely. They've been committing genocide for centuries. Lisa looked at the evidence scrolling past and felt her anger transform into cold determination. "Can you transmit this to every world in the galaxy?" "Already doing it," Kevin replied. "I'm sending everything to news networks, government centers, and private communication systems across 800 worlds. They won't be able to suppress." This High Arbiter Quellenth materialized in the communications center in a blaze of crystalline fury. The alien's body pulsed with dangerous energy as it prepared to destroy the entire room rather than allow the truth to spread. "Primitive creatures, you have doomed your entire species," Quellenth said in a voice like shattering glass. "The Council will burn every death world in the galaxy to prevent this contamination from spreading." Jake stepped forward and looked directly at the High Arbiter without flinching. "Go ahead and try. You've gotten soft from centuries of bullying helpless victims. Let's see how you handle a real fight." The confrontation was interrupted by Security Chief Amy Johnson bursting through the doors with her army of former gladiators. They were armed with weapons taken from the station's armory, and their faces showed the fierce joy of beings who had remembered what it meant to be warriors. "Captain, the enforcement fleets are moving into attack position," Amy reported. 30 warships surrounding the station and more coming from nearby systems. Engineer Rick Peters joined them carrying a portable computer terminal that showed the station's power grid. "I've rigged the main reactor to overload if they try to destroy us. If they attack this station, the explosion will take out half their fleet." Quellenth's crystalline body flickered with uncertainty as it processed this information. The Council had always been able to rely on superior numbers and technology to crush any resistance, but the Deathworld species had turned the station itself into a weapon that could destroy the attacking fleet. "You would commit suicide rather than surrender?" Quellenth asked with something that might have been confusion. "We'd rather die free than live as slaves," Lisa replied firmly. "That's something your soft, civilized species could never understand." Throughout the galaxy, the truth was spreading like wildfire as Kevin's data burst reached billions of beings on hundreds of worlds. The evidence of Council genocide and oppression was undeniable, and many species that had considered themselves civilized began to question everything they had been taught about. Deathworld barbarians on the Garden World Velenar crowds gathered in the capital city's main square to watch the broadcasts coming from the rebel station. The soft, slug-like Vellani had always believed they were the galaxy's natural rulers because of their peaceful nature and refined culture. But now they were seeing footage of their council forces executing children and enslaving entire civilizations. "This cannot be true," one Vellani citizen said to another. "We are a peaceful species. We would never permit such brutality." But the evidence was overwhelming, and some Vellani began to realize that their peaceful paradise had been built on the suffering of others. Their beautiful cities and abundant food supplies came from Deathworld slaves working in mines and farms under Horrific conditions. Similar scenes played out on worlds throughout the galaxy as the Council's lies were exposed. Species that had never questioned the galactic hierarchy suddenly found themselves forced to confront uncomfortable truths about their own complicity in the system on the frozen world of Kethmer Zixtar as people watched the broadcasts with growing excitement. Their reptilian faces showed emotions that had been suppressed for decades as they saw their friend and former leader fighting for freedom on the rebel station. Zixtar lives, one of them whispered in amazement. We thought the Council had killed him years ago. The broadcast from the station included a direct message from Zixtar to his people. My fellow Kethmor, the time has come to remember who we were before the Council broke our spirits. We are the children of lava and stone. We do not kneel to soft creatures who have never faced hardship. Across the galaxy, similar messages were being received by oppressed populations, who had been told for generations that resistance was impossible. The Deathworld species began to stir with the first hope they had felt in centuries. Back on the station, the final confrontation was reaching its climax as Counselor Velanathi arrived with a full escort of elite guards. The massive slug-like alien looked at the freed prisoners with disgust and disbelief. How dare you primitive creatures presume to judge your betters, Velanathi said in its musical voice. We brought peace and order to a chaotic galaxy. Without our guidance, the universe would be consumed by endless warfare. Ambassador Lisa Carter stepped forward to face the Counselor directly. You brought slavery and genocide. You eliminated every species that could challenge your power and called it peace. We eliminated species that were too violent and aggressive to coexist with civilized beings, Velanathi replied. The strong must be controlled for the safety of the weak. No, Jake said firmly. The strong exist to protect the weak, not to exploit them. That's something humans learned long ago when we stopped being barbarians and started being civilized. Dr. Kevin Walsh looked up from his computer terminal with excitement. Captain, I'm getting responses from Deathworld colonies throughout the galaxy. They're rising up against their council overseers. This is spreading faster than we hoped. The news sent a wave of panic through the council forces as they realized that this wasn't just a local uprising. The rebellion was becoming a galaxy-wide revolution that threatened the very foundation of their civilization. High Arbiter Quellenth made a desperate decision and ordered the enforcement fleets to attack the station regardless of the consequences. Destroy the rebels even if it means losing ships. We cannot allow this contamination to spread further, but the Council had made a fatal error in their response. They were still thinking like rulers trying to crush a slave revolt instead of recognizing that they were facing a war for the future of galactic civilization. Engineer Rick Peters activated the station's improvised defenses as the Council warships opened fire. The ancient alien technology had been modified with human ingenuity and Deathworld determination. Weapons that had been designed for crowd control were turned into military-grade defensive systems. Security, Chief Amy Johnson coordinated the station's defense with tactical skills that no Council species possessed. Her army of former slaves fought with the fury of beings who had nothing left to lose and everything to gain. The battle was fierce but brief. The Council's warships were crewed by species that had never faced real military opposition. When confronted with enemies who fought back with intelligence and determination, they quickly discovered that superior numbers meant nothing without superior will. As Council ships burned in the darkness around the station, their crews began to surrender rather than face destruction. Many of them had never been in a real battle, and they were not prepared for the brutal reality of warfare against opponents who refused to give up. The victory at the station was just the beginning. Across the galaxy, Deathworld species were breaking free from centuries of oppression and reclaiming their right to exist as equals. The revolution spread from world to world as enslaved populations threw off their chains and demanded justice. Captain Jake Morrison found himself leading not just a prison break, but a galactic civil war. The New Horizon had managed to dock with the station during the battle and now served as a command ship for the growing rebel fleet. Ambassador Lisa Carter negotiated with moderate Council species, who were horrified by the evidence of genocide and wanted to find a peaceful solution. But the terms were non-negotiable. The caste system had to end, and all species had to be granted equal rights, regardless of their homeworld classification. Dr. Kevin Walsh worked with scientists from dozens of species to establish new classification systems based on merit and achievement, rather than planetary origin. The old hierarchy was replaced with a new understanding that diversity and adaptation were strengths rather than weaknesses. Engineer Rick Peters led efforts to share technology freely throughout the galaxy. The artificial scarcity that had kept Deathworld species dependent on Council handouts was ended as knowledge became available to anyone who wanted to learn. Security. Chief Amy Johnson trained integrated defense forces that protected all species equally. The new galactic military was built on principles of mutual cooperation rather than species-based hierarchies. The war lasted 3 years and reshaped the galaxy completely. When it ended, the Council's oppressive system had been replaced by a true galactic republic where every species had an equal voice in determining their future. Captain Jake Morrison stood before the new Galactic Assembly addressing representatives from over 1,000 different worlds. Jake Morrison stepped off the shuttle onto the gleaming platform of Nexus Prime. The massive space station stretched in all directions, its curved walls disappearing into the distance. He had seen pictures of the Galactic Council headquarters, but nothing prepared him for the sheer scale of it. The place was designed to make visitors feel small and insignificant. Lisa Parker, his young aide, walked beside him carrying a briefcase full of diplomatic documents. Behind them, Commander Rickstone kept his hand near his sidearm, though he knew it would be useless if things went wrong. They were deep in Council space, surrounded by alien warships and technology that made Earth's best weapons look like toys. Jake had been Earth's top diplomat for 20 years. He had negotiated peace treaties between warring nations, solved trade disputes, and talked his way out of more dangerous situations than he could count. But this felt different. The aliens they were about to meet had been playing political games. For thousands of years, while humans were still learning to make fire, the Council had been making Earth wait for 3 years. 3 years of paperwork, tests, and humiliating inspections. They had sent teams to study human society, poking and prodding at everything from art to military tactics. The message was clear. Humans were children begging to sit at the adult table. A group of Valdari guards approached them. The aliens stood 7 feet tall, their silver skin gleaming under the station's lights. They moved with the fluid grace of beings who had never known physical labor. Their leader, a female with intricate tattoos covering her arms, spoke in perfect English. "Ambassador Morrison, you will follow us to the Council chamber. Your weapons will remain here." Rickstone started to protest, but Jake raised a hand. "It's all right, Commander. We're here under diplomatic immunity. They won't harm us." The words felt hollow even as he spoke them. Jake had read every report about the Council's treatment of other species. The lucky ones became junior partners, forever grateful for scraps from the table. The unlucky ones simply disappeared from galactic politics. They walked through corridors filled with aliens from dozens of species. Most moved aside when they saw the humans coming, staring with curiosity or contempt. Jake noticed that the smaller species, the ones who served the Council as clerks and translators, looked at them with something that might have been hope. The Council chamber was a vast oval room with 5 elevated platforms arranged in a circle. Each platform held the representative of one of the major species. The Valdari sat on crystalline thrones that seemed to grow from the floor itself. The Krex representatives stood behind weapons that looked more like art than tools of war. The Zephyrians floated in bubbles of liquid that allowed them to breathe their native atmosphere. The Ethereals appeared as shifting patterns of light and energy. The Chitauri representative was a living mass of insects that moved and spoke as one. Jake had studied each species for months. The Valdari believed themselves to be the natural rulers of the galaxy, gifted with superior intelligence and natural grace. The Krex respected only strength and viewed diplomacy as a weakness. The Zephyrians cared about nothing but profit and trade routes. The ethereals were ancient beyond measure, having evolved past physical form millennia ago. The Chitauri were a hive mind that thought in terms of collective benefit rather than individual rights. None of them had ever faced a species quite like humanity. Zirith, the Valdari Prime Minister, began to speak. His voice carried the weight of absolute authority. Ambassador Morrison, we have completed our evaluation of your species. The Council has reached a decision regarding Earth's application for membership. Jake felt his heart racing, but kept his face calm. We're honored by your consideration, Prime Minister. Earth looks forward to contributing to galactic peace and prosperity. A sound that might have been laughter came from the Krex platform. War Leader Thax leaned forward, his scarred face twisted into what humans would recognize as a sneer. Your species is young and aggressive. You have fought wars among yourselves for your entire history. What makes you think you deserve a place among civilized beings? Because we learned from those wars, Jake replied. We've built a united world government. We've eliminated poverty and disease. We've reached for the stars not out of greed, but out of hope for a better future. The ethereal representative spoke next, its voice like wind through crystal. Hope is irrelevant. Your species has expanded too quickly, claimed too many worlds. Your technology advances at an alarming rate. You present a threat to galactic stability. Jake felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. This wasn't going the way he had expected. We've never attacked anyone. Every world we've settled was uninhabited. We followed all Council regulations regarding expansion and development. Regulations, Zirith said, that were designed for species that understand their place in the natural order. Your people lack the wisdom that comes with age. You push boundaries that should not be pushed. The Zephyrian representative, a creature that looked like a cross between a jellyfish and a sea anemone, pulsed with different colors as it spoke. The trade routes are disturbed. Human merchants offer better prices, better goods. The traditional order is threatened. Jake began to understand. This wasn't about Earth's qualifications for membership. It was about the Council's fear of losing control. Humanity had been making friends among the minor species, offering fair trades and genuine partnerships. The Council members wanted to maintain their monopoly on power. Prime Minister, Jake said carefully, if Earth has somehow offended the Council, we're willing to discuss modifications to our expansion policies. We believe there's room in the galaxy for everyone. Zirith's expression grew cold. Indeed there is, Ambassador. But that room must be properly organized. We offer Earth a choice. Accept Council oversight of your government, surrender your military fleet to our control, and submit to permanent restrictions on your expansion. In return, you will be granted junior membership status. The chamber fell silent. Jake looked at Lisa, who was staring at the aliens with barely concealed horror. Rick Stone's hand had moved to his weapon, though he knew it was useless. And if we refuse? Jake asked. Then you will serve as an example to other species who might consider challenging the established order. Jake straightened his shoulders. He thought of President Sullivan, who had chosen him for this mission because she trusted his judgment. He thought of the billions of people on Earth who were counting on him to stand up for their freedom. He thought of the minor species who had whispered to him in the corridors, begging for help against their oppressors. Prime Minister, he said, his voice steady and clear, Earth seeks partnership, not subjugation. We came here in good faith, hoping to join a community of equals. We will not surrender our sovereignty to anyone. Zirith nodded, as if he had expected this answer. Then you have made your choice. The Valdari leader raised his hand. Guards appeared from hidden doors around the chamber. Their weapons were already drawn and aimed at the human delegation. Wait, Jake said, stepping forward. We're here under diplomatic immunity. This violates every law of civilized conduct. Laws, Zirith replied, are made by the strong to govern the weak. You are about to learn your place in the natural order. The energy beams hit Jake first, burning through his chest in an instant. Lisa screamed as she fell, her briefcase spilling documents across the floor. Rick Stone managed to draw his weapon before the third beam took him down. The execution was broadcast live across council space. The message was clear: this is what happens to those who challenge the established order. But as Jake Morrison died on the floor of the council chamber, he smiled. Earth would not let this go unanswered. His people had faced extinction before and survived. They had fought impossible wars and won. The council had just made the greatest mistake in galactic history. They had given humanity a reason to go to war.